Michigan's Children proudly presents Speaking for Kids, the podcast where we explore crucial conversations impacting the lives of all Michigan children, youth, and families, especially the most vulnerable. Join us each month as we explore public policies and issues in the best interest of our kids and families. We'll bring you lawmakers and policymakers, advocates fighting for change, and the people most affected by those decisions. We'll invite you to become engaged too and show you how to take action on what matters most to you. Episodes are recorded live and shared virtually on YouTube and the audio hosting sites Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify.
Hello, thank you, and welcome to our Speaking for Kids podcast. My name is Dr. Heather Baumsta. I'm the Vice President of Policy and Programs here at Michigan's Children. And today I'm very lucky to be joined by some very esteemed guests. We have Michigan Senator Mary Cavanagh from Michigan's 6th District. We have Liz Balk, a policy strategist at the American Civil Liberties Union of Michigan, and Christine Sauvé, a policy engagement and communication manager for the Michigan Immigrant Rights Center. And today we want to talk, about a year ago, we did a podcast on the impact of immigration enforcement on kids in Michigan. And so we're revisiting that topic a year later to kind of see where we are and see what has changed. So according to Bridge, Michigan, more than 2,349 people, including children, were detained in Michigan between January and October of 2025, which is almost 3 times the number that were detained in the same time period in 2024. And we should note that the vast majority of those detained in Michigan had no criminal record when they were picked up. Federal policy used to prohibit immigration enforcement from conducting operations in some places that were deemed sensitive, including hospitals, schools, childcare centers, churches. The current administration has ended that decades-long policy, and we're seeing immigration enforcement officers enter daycare centers in Chicago, use chemical spray on students outside a high school in Minneapolis, and pick up parents at an Ypsilanti school bus stop or school-adjacent bus stop. So things have changed since last year. Christine, let's start with you. How MERC, the Michigan Immigrant Rights Center, MERC, works with a lot of families. So how do immigration actions in spaces where kids are present impact kids and their families? And how are Michigan kids faring with the increased immigration enforcement that we're seeing in Michigan in this last year?
Yeah, thank you for inviting us to this conversation. As you stated, we're definitely seeing an increase in immigration enforcement across the state. So this is in urban, rural, and suburban areas. And broadly speaking, children and families are experiencing a high degree of fear and anxiety as a result. Both children and families and parents are afraid to go to school or participate in school activities. And they're also expressing fear and anxiety about seeking services that they're eligible for, whether that is healthcare or food assistance. And again, this is even for individuals who have lawful immigration status. Part of this stems from the fact that, as you mentioned, we are seeing more people detained across the state, people whose status was ended by new Trump policies, but who have pending applications for immigration relief like asylum. People are being detained longer and at taxpayer expense, when in the past they would have been released while awaiting their court date. ICE already knows their identity, and so in the past they recognized it didn't make sense to detain those individuals because it can take many months for their case to go through the courts. So now we're seeing people detained indefinitely and in poor conditions. And it really seems like the goal is to make life so unbearable that people will give up their claims in court. But importantly, this is creating a second family separation crisis because so many parents are being separated from their children, many of whom are U.S. citizens, as they're experiencing this prolonged detention. In the case of unaccompanied children, we are aware of several cases where children have been returned to federal custody because their caretaker was detained. Um, and then we've seen also in Michigan some cases of children who were detained because should not be detained in adult detention centers. So the children were sent to family detention in Texas. However, we do know of at least one case where a child in Michigan was wrongfully detained in an adult detention center. I don't have more details about that case at this time because it's ongoing, but it's very concerning because that's a flagrant violation of current policy. But several children now have witnessed, very traumatic events. We're also seeing increased violence during those arrests. So, for example, one family in Washtenaw County was refueling at a gas station. The father was in the back seat with his young daughter, 9 years old. They were quickly surrounded by unmarked cars, and the officers started yelling at the child. She was clinging to the father and crying, and they had to physically remove her from the father and then immediately tased the father. And then aggressively pulled him from the vehicle and pushed him to the ground so hard that the family was worried that his shoulder or his arm was broken. Um, and the daughter, was crying and witnessed this whole scene. When we visited the father in detention, he was badly bruised and scraped. And again, the daughter saw this whole incident. We had another case where a new mother was detained and was supposed to be released from detention so she could be reunited with her newborn baby, and that release was, needlessly delayed. And then, of course, we've seen several cases of high school students who were detained and deported. And I want to flag one case in particular because it really highlights another trend that we're seeing, which is the involvement of local law enforcement. So many individuals, their arrest by ICE or CBP actually starts from a benign traffic interaction, a traffic stop with a local law enforcement agency. In one case, a young high school student was stopped by local police, and the incident wrongfully escalated to the officer contacting Customs and Border Protection, and the high school student and his mother were arrested and are facing deportation now. And again, that was because the local police officer really violated protocol in that instance, and the body cam footage bore that out in really heartbreaking ways, and even admitted on the footage that he had very little familiarity with immigration law or policy and really had no business going beyond the scope of his duties as a local law enforcement officer. So that's some of the ways that we're seeing impacts on children and families. It's really heartbreaking. And every day we see new cases where children are really bearing the brunt of this terrible new immigration enforcement regime.
Wanted to ask you kind of you're seeing and how kids and families that you interact with and the ACLU of Michigan interacts with. How are kids and families in your sphere being impacted?
Thank you, Dr. Baumstra, for the question and for having us here today. Much like Christine was just talking about, a lot of the work that the ACLU of Michigan is doing is around the unlawful detention of people specifically in Michigan, in Baldwin, Michigan, at North Lake Detention Center. And one of the things that we've seen the administration do is change, as you sort of alluded to earlier, around the decades-long policy of the sensitive location memo for ICE. We've also seen last summer the Trump administration change policy that that essentially said if you are in the United States without status, or you entered the United States without status, then you are subject to mandatory detention. And so we've seen just thousands of people stuck in detention, unable to fight their underlying immigration cases out with their family, working with their immigration attorney out in communities, and they are instead sitting in detention, without respect to analysis around whether or not they're a flight risk, whether or not they even have any criminal records. So right now, there's been a great partnership between the Michigan Immigrant Rights Center and the ACLU of Michigan, really filing dozens and dozens of, if not hundreds, of habeas petitions, essentially saying you have violated these folks' due process rights to have a chance to apply for bond, to have a chance to say, I'm not a risk to the community. I'm not going to flee. I will show up to my hearings and fight my immigration case at home. And so with this partnership, not only has the ACLU been able to file dozens of these cases, setting the precedent to release folks, successfully file these petitions to release folks here in Michigan, but Michigan Immigrant Rights Center and ACLU of Michigan have also been training other practitioners and helping hundreds of other people apply for the same type of relief so that they're not sitting behind bars, trying to fight their cases, which is already an incredibly complicated, difficult, expensive process as it is. They can actually do that back at home with their family. And to your question about kids, I think as Christine was mentioning, there is a family detention center in Dilley, Texas. And we are seeing and hearing there, but also here at Northlake, of conditions that are really not that are not good for anybody. Definitely food down in Dilley being not appropriate for kids. And so seeing kids losing a lot of weight because they're not able to eat the food there, let alone reports of moldy food or bad water, inadequate medical treatment. And again, those are some of the complaints that we've heard up here at Northlake as well, even though it's an adult detention center. Similar allegations around inadequate medicine, medical care, and food, quality of food, quantity of food, even. And access to making sure that folks have access to attorneys, whether or not they're actually represented, making sure that organizations like Merck can get in and conduct Know Your Rights trainings for folks who are just getting detained at Northlake. So those are some of the things that we've been seeing on the ground here in Michigan and across the country.
And we should say that for a lot of those folks, those are the people who are being detained now. If they didn't have criminal records, they would have been out and working in their communities, supporting their families in past years, right? Before this change in these immigration rules, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And also the administration was sort of not even considering those at all when they sort of changed that policy in the summer, right? Like it didn't even matter whether or not somebody had a criminal background or whether or not they were a flight risk. It was just a blanket, policy that changed for everybody. And so we can really see the difference between what the administration is saying, that they're trying to go after so-called criminals or sort of the worst of the worst. And really, we know on the ground, actually, they're applying this to everybody across the board, including children and families, like you were mentioning, Dr. Baumstra.
Okay. Thank you. So we know that in Michigan, immigration enforcement has ramped up. And so have the concerns of neighbors and other citizens. And many neighbors are trying to protect the children and the families that they've known for decades. And many are concerned at some of the tactics that they see being used in Minnesota as well as in Michigan. So what should community members know about their rights and safety?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think especially in light of what we've been seeing happen in Minnesota, I think a lot of Michiganders are also asking those same questions. How do we come out and protect our neighbors and our friends and our family members? And so the ACLU and the Michigan Immigrant Rights Center have a lot of really great resources that we can share with you after the podcast if you like. You can certainly link to those on our websites. Great resources for schools and for soon to be, we'll have a resource for healthcare providers. And then just basic know your rights so that folks can, if you are not an immigrant yourself, but you are an ally, we've got great resources around providing know your rights presentations. Both Merck and ACLU and other orgs are doing that across the state every day. And also for impacted communities, making sure that folks understand, hey, these are your rights no matter what. If you're a U.S. citizen or not, everybody has the same constitutional rights, and making sure folks really understand those things. And so, yeah, we do have I can see that Christine is putting a lot of resources in the chat. She is the queen of making sure that people have information and making sure that that gets distributed out to our communities. But yeah, basic information like, what should folks be looking for in terms of warrants, these sort of administrative warrants that we've been hearing about versus judicial warrants, and just making sure that people are staying safe too. We know that ICE and the administration have been ramping up the aggression in these tactics. And as you mentioned too, and I know the senator will talk about this with her bill, even spaces that had really been sort of sacred spaces, trusted spaces that ICE had not been going into, we now see that they are pushing the envelope there. So yeah, we have a lot of resources for folks, and we can certainly share that with you and your listeners.
I can
That's
share just a few more thoughts on that question. So we do encourage community members to share know your rights information broadly so that their neighbors have that. There are a few things that immigrant families can do, some steps that folks can take in advance to collect their documents in one place, prepare temporary designations of parental authority in case of their absence. So we have that information for families. Community members can also, as Liz mentioned, follow up with their school districts to make sure they have good policies in place there. Individuals can also make calls to their elected officials. And so both the Michigan Immigrant Rights Center and ACLU, we have lots of examples. I'll put that link for you to share as well. And then lastly, I just want to lift up really creative fundraising is helpful right now for two key areas. One is for mutual aid efforts as families are being affected. Families are losing their breadwinners and having difficulty making ends meet. And then fundraising for legal services. That's sort of the last line of defense for individuals. Our state, our nonprofit and low-cost legal services were already stretched thin before this administration took place. And so currently there's not enough services for the people who need them. And so fundraising for legal services so that people can have access to legal advice when they need it in their time of need.
Thank you. Senator Cavanagh, we want to talk to you now about, you've proposed a state law that would create safe spaces in Michigan, similar to how immigration enforcement was conducted for many decades. So tell us more about what your bill defines as safe spaces and why it's important specifically for kids to reinstate these safe spaces.
Absolutely. And thank you for having us on. And this is just a very important conversation all throughout Michigan, no matter what your district looks like or your constituency. These are affecting all of our communities and all of our kids. And so I did introduce a bill that would create safe spaces in Michigan, or I would even say recreate. And those would specifically focus around children and families, around health and safety spaces like schools, hospitals, places of worship, courtrooms and organizations providing services to vulnerable individuals, like we're thinking about domestic violence shelters, as safe spaces from immigration enforcement unless there is an imminent public danger or a signed judicial warrant. This has actually been the standard federal policy for decades under administration on Democrat and Republican. And I just really want to highlight, like, when immigration enforcement, as we hear from Merck and ACLU, they show up in places where children are supposed to feel safe. It really disrupts the child's sense of safety and security, and it really becomes a core memory of their lives. And kids and our children don't really understand federal policy changes or immigration enforcement, but they do understand the fear that this is creating and the consequences of these actions when armed officers are violating a place that really is just supposed to be focused on education, when neighbors and childhood classmates are potentially going missing and never seen again. And we know from decades of child development and research that stress and chronic trauma can have a long-term impact on our children and academic performance, physical well-being. Children may stop going to school, disengage in the classroom, struggle with anxiety or sleep, more likely need mental health and behavioral health in the future. And honestly, we're even hearing some children feel responsible for possibly not sticking up for their classmate or being there to save them. So this really isn't about obstructing federal law. It's about Michigan choosing not to partner and participate in actions that traumatize children and destabilize families and communities. And so for kids, this is really critically important. When schools become a place of fear instead of learning, everyone suffers, from attendance to all of our parents' academic success. So we really wanted to reinstate the safe space given to families so they can have the confidence that they can send their kids to school, access healthcare, or even participate in the community of public safety, reporting a crime for communities without feeling the risk of separation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there have been examples of armed ICE officers going into emergency rooms in Minnesota. And I can't imagine how that would impact all of the people in those emergency rooms, but especially children, where, it's already a place that could be stressful or scary. And then you add armed people on top of that, or a risk of family separation, or a concern at seeing someone else harmed. These are very traumatic incidences for any child who is in that vicinity, classmates, as well as citizen children who may have mixed status families. So, we're really talking about harm to all of the children. And keeping masked, armed officers out of some of these spaces is really critical to families being able to get medical care. I know that there's at least one case of a family being detained in a hospital parking lot where they were trying to get care for a child. And so, when we have immigration enforcement in some of these spaces, we're actually creating the potential for greater harm. A child not getting the care that they need, not getting access to daycare or education, or some of these very basic things that help kids to grow up healthy and well.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you kind of mentioned that. Not only is it going in tandem with our children and our families not having those safe spaces or feeling confident to report crimes, we're also seeing the danger of our mass individuals and unidentifiable individuals. And so my Senate bill on safe spaces go in tandem with two other legislative initiatives to help protect Michiganders, especially our children. Specifically, Senator Jeremy Moss, Senate Bill 510, would prohibit law enforcement officers from concealing their identity when performing their duties. So masked and unidentifiable law enforcement agencies, they further traumatize our communities, stoking fear, violence, and mistrust. And I know we've gone over some things that have happened not only in the state of Michigan, but across the country. We've seen some bad actors utilize the anonymity that comes with the mass and unidentifiable and pretend to be law enforcement to commit some heinous crimes to not only people within status or just US citizens or even any kids. And I also want to mention Senate Bill 509, introduced by Senator Chang, that prohibits personal data from being shared for the purpose of immigration enforcement unless there is a judicial warrant. This could be tax data, school records, and more that can enhance immigration enforcement ability to target Michiganders without due process. And I know we heard from Merck, just a simple traffic violation, going to school or with your family is now turning into a place of fearing for their lives. And so these bills are not to overstep federal law. This is to tell Michiganders, we are not going to take away your rights. We do want due process, and we want our communities, no matter what your status and no matter what you look like, to feel safe.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, when kids see masked armed men, they see villains, right? That's what kids see because that's what they see in movies. So they see the bad guys. And when law enforcement acts in those ways,
right, kids don't understand who these people are who are taking their friends.
So it creates a real break in terms of being able to tell kids that those might be people who could help them if they were in danger, because they don't look like the good guys. They look very, very scary. And for kids, even kids who are just adjacent to it or witnessing it, this is terrifying. They don't know who these actors are. They don't know if these are if their friends are safe, if the people that they're seeing arrested are safe, or if they're being kidnapped. It can create a lot of fear and a lot of trauma for children who are just even witnessing this. So I think
we would like to see the masks removed as well.
And there would help to eliminate masked law enforcement, although there are some exceptions for undercover and some other things where those masks there might be legitimate reasons for that. But in general, we have a firm belief that law enforcement should not be masked.
Of course. And those exceptions are in the bill. But as we know, in our even local law enforcement, we hold accountability, we hold transparency, and we need to hold it all the way across the board. For our children, as you said, doctor, for them to maybe lose their parent or something to happen to them and see them as a place for help. See law enforcement and local officials not as fear and a place to go and to be helpful.
Yeah. So what's next for these bills, Senator Cavanagh?
That's a great question. So we've had a couple committee hearings, some overwhelming public support. Not only was the hearing rooms packed, I believe 3 overflow rooms, as well as hundreds of individuals submitted their support online. It really just showed how many Michiganders care about due process, transparency, and this is about all of our communities. So the next steps is these bills moving out of the Senate Civil Rights, Judiciary and Public Safety Committee, and then on the Senate floor for a vote. So we can send it over to the Michigan House of Representatives. Once it passes that, it could be signed into law. So how to get that is advocates can help by continuing to share their stories, by calling and emailing their senators, submitting written testimony, and showing up as advocates even at the Capitol. Lawmakers need to hear not just statistics, but lived experiences from our districts all across Michigan. We also may hold another public forum to hear local community members on this matter. So please follow along some e-news or even your local senators. I am the chair of the Michigan Latino Caucus, so we'll also be putting that information out, and we'll be letting our stakeholders, ACLU and Merck, also know where community members that weren't able to go to Lansing show up to share their voice and how important it is. So I think from right now, it's sharing your story, making sure this is an important matter, writing letters and showing no matter if you're a Democrat or Republican, this is important for our state.
Absolutely. And please share those with us as well so we can share them out through our network. We have a lot of people who are concerned about children and their families and communities in Michigan. And so we appreciate that. We should mention that we have a pre-written letter to the Michigan legislature and governor in support of these bills. And there are a couple of national efforts as well to reinstate safe spaces on a national level. So we will post some of those actions as well, along with this podcast. And just want to say, are there any final comments that anyone wants to leave our audience with?
I just echo what the senator said. Please contact your state senator to help advance those bills. And we appreciate everyone who is following this issue and speaking up in their local communities as well, at their local city council, advocating for those better policies with their local law enforcement agencies, with their school districts. We really appreciate everyone in these difficult times.
Yeah, and if I can add, the importance of not only contacting your state legislators, but what Christine said, also local, because local law enforcement, as well as your local municipality, might be making some of these policy decisions. But I also want to note, when you are contacting your legislators, no matter which side of the aisle, I think it is very important to ground in stories, as also ground in the idea of protecting children, local control, public safety. Not only is this important for the immigrant community, which is very, very important, but it's also important for every single person in Michigan. It's important for all of our residents, as we talked about today, to make sure that it's safe and we're not hindering public safety. We're supporting it.
And I think I would just sort of lift up the idea that I think the senator just said this beautifully, like the types of policies that her bill and her colleagues' bills would do would actually make our communities much safer. And right now, the way that the federal administration is running its operation is it's tearing apart these families, which is tearing apart our communities, which isn't good for anybody, and certainly not good for kids' psychological well-being or any of our psychological well-beings. And so I think it can be a communal response into this moment and an individual response. However this issue hits you, I think it's a great idea, as Christine and Senator Cavanagh said, reach out to your lawmakers, whether or not they're Republican or Democrat. They need to hear from you and explain why it's so important to you. And there are so many reasons, economic down to, protecting kids. So just pick whatever lane you want to pick and advocate from that space.
And I'm sorry if I could add one more thing. Most, if not all, legislators have coffee hours. They like to go into the community. They like to give updates. Please look for your local state legislator coffee hour so you can advocate in person, because sometimes the letters get lost in the mail. And seeing that real person and that advocate really, really moves mountains and actually holds them a little bit more accountable as well.
Absolutely. We definitely have high expectations and should have high expectations for our legislators. They are public servants, they are elected, and they're elected to do a job. So holding them accountable, meeting with them, developing relationships so that we can advocate and make sure that they're doing the job that we want them to do to protect our communities is very important. So thank you, Senator Cavanagh, for that. I appreciate it. Michigan's Children will be running this campaign to send some letters in support of Senator Cavanagh's bill and Senator Moss's bills for safe spaces and keeping law enforcement unmasked in the community as much as possible. We're also going to be participating in a national campaign to end child and family detention. It's called the Paper Dolls campaign. It's sponsored by a number of very respectable national organizations. There'll be more information on our website about that. We'd love to have you join us in that as well. So thank you very much today. We have a lot of resources we'll be posting with this podcast, and we'll also be having those on our website. So if you have any questions, reach out to us. But thank you all very much for joining us today, for having this conversation, for taking the time to be here and advocate for kids.
You've been listening to Speaking for Kids, the podcast for Michigan's children. Thanks for joining us. To explore these and other issues relevant to our state's children, youth, and families, and to build your advocacy muscle, go to our website at www.michiganschildren.org. You'll find links and news about past and future podcast topics under our Resource tab and action alerts under the Take Action tab. Find and like us on Facebook and Twitter. And Stephen Wallace produced this podcast. Contact them with your questions and ideas for other topics. Michigan's Children is a nonprofit advocacy organization, an independent voice working to reduce disparities in child outcomes from cradle to career through policy change.